Hi everyone and welcome back to Stellar HFY. First of all, thank you. Seriously, the engagement on our recent military strategy episodes has been absolutely phenomenal. Today, we follow Admiral Thyrak, a brilliant alien commander with 30 cycles of perfect victories as he faces an enemy that learns faster than any military can adapt. So grab your headphones and get comfortable. Let's begin. Every species believes they understand warfare. But warfare belongs only to those who have faced the impossible and survived to whisper its secrets. The Battle of Hive's End would teach the galaxies this truth, written in the wreckage of certainty and the silence that follows absolute victory. It was then that Admiral Thyrak first learned what humans call strategy, 30 cycles. 30 cycles of perfect victories had carved Thyrak's name into the annals of Zolonian military history. 12 star systems spoke his name with reverence. The methodical genius, the undefeated. Academic halls echoed with lectures on his tactical brilliance. Young officers studied his formations with religious devotion. Then came the silence. The first reports arrived as whispers from the void. Colonial Station Epsilon 7 had gone dark. Standard. Routine. Nothing more than a communication relay failure or solar interference. Such things happened on the rim where the black pressed close against civilization's fragile light. But silence has its own gravity. It pulls at the mind like the event horizon of a black hole, drawing attention to what should not be there. Thyrak dispatched reconnaissance squadrons. Standard procedure, standard doctrine, standard assumptions. They found nothing, empty space where thriving colonies should have hummed with industry and life. No debris fields, no distress beacons, no survivors drifting in escape pods with tales of pirates or system failures, nothing but the cold, inscience, difference of vacuum and the distant stars that had witnessed. What? Admiral? The aide's voice carried tremors that had no place on a command bridge. Stations Gamma 4 and Delta 9 have also ceased transmission. 3 colonies vanished, as if they had never existed at all. The tactical display painted the truth in harsh geometric lines. The missing stations formed a perfect triangle in space, not random, not accidental. This was coordination. This was intelligence. This was something that thought. Increase patrols along the outer rim, Thyrak commanded, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades' certainty. Deploy battle groups Alpha and Beta to defensive positions. Standard response, standard doctrine, standard thinking that would prove as fragile as atmosphere exposed to vacuum. They came from the deep black like nightmares given form and purpose. Ships that moved wrong. Ships that curved where they should have been angular, that flowed where they should have been rigid. Organic architecture that hurt to perceive directly, as if the mind recoiled from comprehending what evolution had never prepared it to understand. The Hive had awakened. Thyrak watched the first engagement from his flagship's command center, surrounded by tactical displays and the quiet competence of officers who believed in his legend. Defensive perimeters established with mathematical precision, overlapping fields of fire calculated to the microsecond, choke points designed to funnel any enemy into kill zones where superior firepower would decide the outcome. It was perfect. It was textbook. It was useless. The enemy flowed around his defenses like water finding every crack in stone. They adapted in real time to every adjustment, every countermeasure, every desperate modification of formations that had worked for 30 cycles against every opponent the galaxy had produced. Impossible, Thyrak breathed, watching his carefully constructed battle lines dissolve under assault patterns that defied every principle of tactical science. His weapons officer's voice cracked with strain. Admiral, they're learning from every engagement. Each attack pattern we use, they counter within minutes. Learning. The word echoed through the command center like a death knell. Thyrak had built his reputation on the assumption that enemies followed patterns. Predictable behaviors, exploitable weaknesses, logical responses to tactical stimuli. The Hive had no patterns, Or rather, their pattern was adaptation itself. Colonial Station Theta 3 died on the second day. The garrison transmitted until the final seconds, their cameras recording organic ships attaching themselves to the station's hull like parasites feeding on a corpse. The screaming stopped abruptly when the atmosphere vented, but the feeding continued. "They're not destroying the colonies," his intelligence officer reported, voice hollow with implications. "They're consuming them. The populations, the resources, the infrastructure, everything. Consuming. Growing stronger with every victory, while Thyrax's forces grew weaker with every engagement." By the third day, panic infected the outer rim like a plague. Civilian transports fled toward the core systems, their holds packed with refugees and their communications channels filled with impossible stories. The Hive pursued them with relentless patience, harvesting ships as they found them, leaving only silence in their wake. Emergency Council. 7 species represented by holographic projections, their alien faces united in expressions of fear that transcended evolutionary boundaries. "We need unified response," declared the Krathari ambassador, his predatory features twisted with uncharacteristic anxiety. "Pool our fleets. Standard coalition doctrine." "Agreed." The Vespian delegates' insectoid mandibles clicked nervously. "Admiral Thyrax's strategic expertise has never failed us." Never failed. The words, Taz, Ted like ashes in Thyrax's mouth as he outlined defensive strategies that had worked against every enemy he had ever faced. Layered defenses, fortress worlds, strategic withdrawal designed to bleed the enemy while preserving coalition strength. The Hive shattered his plans in 6 hours. They didn't attack where logic dictated. They struck from impossible vectors, emerging from dead space between star systems where no ship should have been able to navigate. They concentrated overwhelming force against single points, then dispersed before counterattacks could be coordinated. They learned from every mistake, adapted to every countermeasure, evolved past every strategy faster than Thyrax could conceive new ones. 3 more worlds fell while he watched helplessly from his command center, surrounded by officers whose faith in his tactical genius cracked a little more with each impossible defeat. Then came the transmission from Sol system, a young species, barely half a century since first contact. Their military considered primitive by galactic standards. Kinetic weapons when civilized species used energy. Chemical propulsion when others had mastered gravity manipulation. "Coalition Command, this is Captain Marcus Steele of the Terran Defense Force. We're monitoring your situation and would like to offer assistance." Assistance. From a species that still threw rocks at their enemies while the greatest military minds in the galaxy struggled against an opponent that made mockery of strategic science. The Council debated while another colony died. The Vespians questioned human competence. The Krathari worried about security breaches. The Andromedans cited technological incompatibility. 7 species arguing while the Hive consumed worlds and grew stronger with each passing hour. "How many ships?" Thyrax asked finally, cutting through the debate with the authority of Desperatio. "And 12 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and a command vessel," Steele replied. "We're not asking for fleet command, Admiral, just permission to embed advisory units with your battle groups." Advisory units? Thyrax almost laughed at the absurdity. What could humans possibly advise about warfare against an enemy that evolved faster than thought itself? But worlds were burning while the Council argued, billions consumed, billions more fleeing in terror toward a core that might not survive long enough to receive them. "Permission granted," Thyrax said, the words feeling like surrender. "But you follow coalition protocols. No independent action without authorization." "Understood, Admiral. We'll be discreet." Discreet. Thyrax studied the approaching human ships on long-range sensors. They looked crude compared to coalition vessels, angular where others achieved elegant curves, harsh where others embodied sophisticated beauty, functional rather than aesthetic, like tools pretending to be art, like weapons that had forgotten they were supposed to be ships. The first human advisor materialized on his bridge 12 hours later. Captain Marcus Steele was smaller than expected, his features unremarkable by any species standards. But his eyes catalogued everything they saw with predatory patience. "Admiral," Steele said, reviewing tactical displays with disturbing focus, "I'd like to suggest some modifications to your defensive positions." "Modifications?" "Pull back Battle Group Charlie from the Proxima choke point. Redeploy them here." Steele indicated coordinates that violated every principle of defensive warfare. "And I recommend we send a probe convoy along this trajectory." Thyrex stared at the proposed route. It would expose the convoy to certain annihilation. "That's suicide, Captain." Marcus smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the expression of something that had learned to find humor in impossible situations. "Trust me, Admiral. Sometimes the best defense is a carefully calculated sacrifice." The words hung in the air like a promise of madness or revelation. There are moments when the universe reveals its true nature to those who dare to look beyond the comfortable lies of logic and reason. The humans had brought such revelation to Thyrax's fleet, wrapped in suggestions that violated every principle of sound military doctrine. They were insane. This conclusion crystallized in Thyrax's mind after watching human advisors spend 3 consecutive engagements proposing tactics designed to maximize casualties while minimizing strategic advantage. Marcus had embedded his people throughout the coalition fleet like a virus spreading through healthy tissue. 1 human advisor per battle group, each suggesting modifications that seemed calculated to expose vital assets to enemy fire. They wanted ships isolated from mutual support. They recommended maneuvers that abandoned defensive advantages for phantom offensive opportunities. They proposed sacrifices that served no tactical purpose Thyrex could comprehend. And yet, impossibly, these suicidal suggestions achieved results that defied analysis. "Admiral," his tactical officer reported after the 3rd engagement, voice heavy with confusion and growing unease, "the hive response patterns are becoming more predictable." Predictable. The word that had eluded Thyrex's grasp for weeks suddenly applied to enemy forces that had previously adapted faster than strategic thought itself. Each engagement revealed increasingly rigid patterns in hive tactical responses. "Explain," Thyrex demanded, leaning over displays that showed enemy movements following mathematical progressions rather than the fluid adaptation that had characterized their earlier encounters. "When we implemented Captain Steele's convoy deployment, the hive attacked from Vector 77 Mark IV. When Battle Group Charlie withdrew from optimal positions, enemy forces moved to exploit what appeared to be tactical weakness. But in both cases, sir, the hive chose the most mathematically efficient response. Most efficient, most logical, most predictable." Thyrax studied engagement reports with growing unease, watching data streams that revealed a disturbing truth. The humans weren't making mistakes. They were offering bait. Carefully calculated stimuli designed to provoke specific responses from an enemy that processed tactical information like a vast computer calculating optimal solutions. "Captain Steele," Thyrex confronted the human advisor during a brief lull between hive probing attacks. "I demand explanations. Your tactics violate basic military doctrine." Marcus looked up from his portable tactical display, that unsettling smile never wavering. Around him, Thyrax's bridge crew worked with the quiet desperation of professionals who no longer understood the war they were fighting. "Admiral," Marcus replied with the calm certainty of someone who had seen this pattern before, "your doctrine assumes rational opponents operating under resource constraints. The hive collective processes information differently." Meaning they optimize for mathematical efficiency. They choose the path of least resistance to maximum strategic gain, the most logically sound approach to any tactical problem. Marcus highlighted enemy movements on the holographic display, patterns within patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Watch their responses. Every decision follows predictive algorithms designed to minimize casualties while maximizing territorial acquisition. Thyrek watched. The data streams flowing across his displays painted an undeniable picture. Hive forces consistently selected the most efficient attack vectors, the most logical targets, the most mathematically sound tactical responses to coalition maneuvers. "They're too perfect," Marcus continued, manipulating the display to show weeks of engagement data compressed into visible patterns. "No waste, no redundancy, no apparent irrationality. That level of optimized ion is their weakness." Weakness. The word hung in the air like hope itself. But before Thyrek could process the implications, alarms screamed throughout the command center. Massive energy signatures bloomed on long-range sensors like malevolent flowers opening to receive the light of distant stars. Emergency klaxons wailed their electronic terror as sensor operators confirmed what the displays already showed. A hive fleet, 3 times larger than anything previously encountered, had emerged from the deep black where no sensors could penetrate. Ships beyond counting, their organic hulls pulsing with malevolent life as they arranged themselves in formations that spoke of overwhelming tactical superiority. "Reinforcements," his sensor operator whispered, voice breaking on the word. "Admiral, we're detecting over 300 vessels. 300 ships against their remaining 47. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Total annihilation expressed in numbers that allowed no hope, no tactical salvation, no strategic miracle that could balance equations written in plasma fire and vacuum-cooled death." "I have a proposal," Marcus said with the calm certainty of someone discussing weather patterns rather than impending extinction. "Let me take my squadron on a reconnaissance mission, deep penetration into their formation. We'll gather intelligence on their command structure." Reconnaissance? Thyrek stared at tactical displays showing enemy formations that could obliterate anything approaching them. "Captain, that fleet will destroy any force that ventures within weapons range. You're proposing suicide." "Perhaps, but the intelligence we gather could be invaluable for the battles to come. Intelligence, data, information purchased with lives and ships and the blood of crews who trusted their commanders to use their sacrifice wisely." Thyrek's strategic tree. Oining screamed warnings against accepting such proposals. They still had options: retreat, regrouping, strategic withdrawal to defensive positions where superior firepower might provide salvation. "Request denied," Thyrek stated firmly, his voice carrying the authority of 30 cycles experience. "We'll implement standard coalition doctrine, fighting retreat to Fortress Kepler, establish defensive perimeters and force them to come to us." Marcus nodded without argument, his expression revealing nothing of disappointment or disagreement. "Understood, Admiral." But understanding and compliance proved to be different concepts entirely. 6 hours later, as coalition forces began their carefully orchestrated withdrawal toward defensive positions that might provide salvation, Thyrek's sensors detected human ships accelerating away from the fleet, not retreating, not following the prescribed tactical withdrawal, accelerating directly toward the hive reinforcements in a display of either supreme courage or complete insanity. "Captain Steele!" Thyrek's communication crackled with fury born of fear and incomprehension. "You are ordered to return to formation immediately." Static filled the channel for long seconds before Marcus's voice emerged from the electronic noise. "Sorry, Admiral. Operational necessity takes precedence. We'll maintain communication as long as possible." Thyrek watched helplessly as 16 human vessels charged toward certain destruction. 300 hive ships moved to intercept with the fluid coordination that had shattered every defense the coalition could devise. The mathematics were obscene in their simplicity. 16 against 300, David charging Goliath while Goliath's brothers waited in formation. The engagement lasted exactly 7 minutes. 7 minutes during which Thyrek expected to witness the obliteration of humanity's contribution to the coalition defense. 7 minutes that should have ended with debris fields and expanding clouds of vented atmosphere marking the graves of crews too brave or too foolish to accept mathematical reality. Instead, when weapons fire faded and sensors recalibrated, 15 human ships emerged from the chaos, damaged but intact, transmitting data streams that made Thyrax's computers work overtime processing information that should not have existed. How? The word escaped Thyrax's lips like a prayer to gods who had forgotten the meaning of mercy. Admiral. His communications officer's voice carried disbelief, wrapped in professional composure. The human ships are transmitting complete tactical profiles on Hive command hierarchies, coordination protocols, behavioral prediction matrices. Sir, they've mapped the enemy's entire decision-making process. Mapped. In 7 minutes of apparent suicide, the humans had accomplished what Coalition intelligence had failed to achieve through weeks of careful observation and analysis. Captain Steele. Thyrax's voice was carefully controlled, each word measured against the weight of implications he could not yet fully comprehend. Report to my ready room, immediately. When Marcus arrived, his uniform bore the scorch marks of emergency decompression procedures. One arm hung in a medical support cradle, but his eyes held the same unsettling confidence that had marked every human interaction since their arrival. Explanation, Thyrax demanded, his voice carrying the accumulated frustration of watching impossible results emerge from suicidal tactics. Now. We gambled, Admiral. Marcus activated his portable hologram projector, filling the space between them with three-dimensional models of Hive ships and tactical formations. And we won. The models showed attack vectors and response patterns that revealed the mathematical precision underlying Hive tactical decisions. Each enemy movement followed algorithms designed to optimize resource expenditure while maximizing strategic advantage. The collective operates through distributed processing nodes, Marcus explained, manipulating the holographic display to show communication networks binding individual ships into unified tactical consciousness. Each vessel contributes computational power to collective decisions, but the system has inherent limitations. What limitations? Predictable optimization patterns. The Hive always chooses the most mathematically efficient solution to any tactical problem. Always. That consistency is their weakness. Marcus highlighted specific engagement data showing how human forces had presented the Hive collective with carefully designed tactical problems that forced predictable responses. 16 ships attacking 300 appears to be suicide from any rational perspective. The most efficient Hive response is to allocate minimal force to guarantee destruction while maintaining formation integrity. They calculated exactly the firepower necessary to obliterate us without compromising their strategic positioning. But you survived. Because we didn't behave rationally, we accepted casualties that no sensible commander would accept. We maintained mission parameters that any logical species would abandon. We prioritized data gathering over survival. Marcus's smile turned predatory. The Hive collective couldn't process our decision-making because it contradicts every survival algorithm in their programming. Thyrax stared at data streams that painted a picture of warfare beyond his comprehension. Human recklessness had yielded intelligence treasures that traditional military doctrine could never have obtained. Their apparent incompetence had revealed enemy vulnerabilities that proper strategy would never have discovered. The implications were staggering. While he had been fighting a conventional war of position and firepower, the humans had been conducting psycholocient warfare against an enemy's decision-making processes themselves. Admiral, his sensor operator's voice cut through contemplation like a blade through flesh. The Hive fleet is moving. They're accelerating toward our position. 300 ships, moving with coordination that had shattered every defense Thyrax could devise. Coming to finish what they had started while he struggled to understand warfare that operated on levels his mind could barely comprehend. But somewhere in the depths of his consciousness, a new understanding began to emerge. The humans had not come to fight the Hive. They had come to teach the galaxy what fighting actually meant. Every war teaches lessons written in blood and vacuum, but some wars teach truths that reshape the very nature of conflict itself. The Hive War would be remembered not for the ships destroyed or worlds consumed, but for the moment when warfare itself evolved beyond recognition. It was then that Admiral Thyrak learned what humans meant when they spoke of strategy. The Hive fleet approached like inevitable death given form and purpose, 300 vessels moving in perfect coordination, their organic hulls pulsing with malevolent intelligence as they arranged themselves for final engagement. 47 coalition ships remained to face annihilation written in mathematics that allowed no hope of survival. 47 minutes until contact, 47 minutes to live. "Admiral?" His tactical officer's voice carried the hollow tone of professionals who had calculated their own extinction. "All defensive positions are compromised. We cannot establish effective resistance patterns against their formation." Cannot. The word that had never applied to Thyrak's strategic thinking now defined reality itself. 30 cycles of tactical genius rendered meaningless by an enemy that adapted faster than thought, evolved beyond Evi. Every countermeasure transcended every principle of warfare that civilized species had developed. "Captain Steele!" Thyrak's voice carried the weight of impending judgment. "I need answers, not theories, not possibilities. Truth." Marcus stood beside the tactical display with the calm certainty of someone who had seen this pattern before. His injured arm hung motionless, but his eyes burned with focus that seemed to penetrate beyond immediate reality to possibilities that existed in dimensions Thyrak could not perceive. "What truth, Admiral? How did your ship survive certain destruction? How do you consistently achieve objectives that violate physical law? And why?" Thyrak's voice rose with accumulated frustration. "Are you not terrified by what approaches us?" Marcus smiled. That expression that had haunted Thyrak's dreams, the smile of something that found humor in situations where humor should not exist. "Because, Admiral, we've been preparing for this moment since the day we learned warfare was more than ships destroying ships." "Preparing? You've been committing tactical suicide for weeks." "No." Marcus activated the holographic display, data streams flowing like rivers of light through three-dimensional space. "We've been conducting the most comprehensive psychological warfare campaign in galactic history." Psychological warfare. Words that carried implications beyond tactical science, beyond strategic theory, beyond everything Thyrak understood about the nature of conflict between thinking species. "Every apparent mistake was calculated," Marcus continued, manipulating displays that showed weeks of engagement data compressed into visible patterns. "Every tactical blunder was designed to feed specific information into the Hive Collective's decision-making algorithms. Every sacrifice served a purpose that went beyond immediate tactical advantage." Thyrak stared at information that redefined his understanding of warfare itself. Patterns within patterns. Res. Ponces designed to provoke responses, designed to condition responses that would ultimately serve purposes invisible to any observer who thought in terms of ships and weapons rather than minds and perceptions. "The Hive learns through observation," Marcus explained. "They build predictive models based on enemy behavior patterns. The more data they gather, the more accurately they can anticipate tactical decisions and prepare optimal countermeasures." "Then why provide them with data?" "Because we controlled what they learned." Marcus highlighted specific engagements, showing how human actions had gradually shaped Hive understanding of coalition capabilities and limitations. When we appeared reckless, they cataloged human behavior as chaotic and unpredictable. When we made obvious tactical errors, they classified us as strategically inferior. When we accepted unnecessary casualties, they marked human forces as expendable resources operating under emotional rather than logical decision-making processes. The implications crashed over Thyrak like the collapse of a star system, reshaping everything he thought he understood about the conflict they had been fighting. You made them underestimate humanity. More than underestimate. We made them fundamentally misunderstand what humans represent. Marcus gestured toward the approaching Hive fleet. Look at their response patterns over the past several engagements. Each tactical decision follows more rigid mathematical progressions than the last. Thyrak studied the data with growing amazement and horror. The Hive Collective, initially fluid and adaptive beyond comprehension, had gradually become formulaic in their tactical responses, efficient, logical, predictable. They believe they've solved the tactical puzzle of human behavior, Marcus continued. Every engagement reinforces their mathematical models of how our species thinks and fights. They're confident in their ability to predict and counter any strategy we might employ. Have they? Marcus's smile transformed into something predatory, something that spoke of evolutionary processes that had shaped thinking beyond the comfortable boundaries of civilized warfare. Admiral, they haven't even begun to understand what humans are capable of when survival demands transcending every limitation that logic imposes. Explain. Human military doctrine didn't evolve against external threats like most species. We developed warfare techniques through millennia of conflict against opponents who shared our intelligence level, our adaptability, our capacity for strategic innovation. Marcus gestured toward tactical displays showing hive formations. Most species fight enemies who are either superior or inferior in obvious ways. Humans learned to fight enemies who could think as well as we could think. The bridge fell silent except for proximity alarms counting down to extinction. 38 minutes to contact. Psychological warfare isn't just deception, Marcus continued. It's understanding how your opponent processes information and manipulating that process to serve your strategic objectives. The Hive Collective operates through distributed intelligence networks that make decisions by analyzing patterns and selecting mathematically optimal responses. And they're victims of their own sophistication. When presented with tactical problems, they invariably choose the most efficient solution, the most logical response, the most mathematically sound approach to achieving strategic objectives. Marcus pulled up detailed analyses of hive decision-making patterns. That consistency makes them more predictable than any enemy humans have ever faced. Thyrak felt his understanding of warfare shift like tectonic plates grinding against fundamental assumptions about the nature of conflict itself. You're saying their intelligence makes them vulnerable? I'm saying their dependence on logical optimization creates exploitable predictabilities in their strategic behavior. Marcus manipulated holographic displays, showing how hive responses to specific tactical stimuli followed mathematical progressions with absolute consistency. Every engagement we've fought has been designed to condition their decision-making algorithms to expect certain patterns from coalition forces. The data was undeniable. When presented with identical tactical scenarios, the Hive Collective chose identical responses with machine-like precision. You can predict their moves. Better than predict, we can control them. Marcus turned to face Thyrak directly. Every apparent defeat we've suffered has been preparing for this moment. We've trained the Hive Collective to respond to coalition behavior in specific, predictable ways that will serve our ultimate strategic objective, which is total victory through the application of strategic thinking that operates on levels the Hive Collective cannot comprehend because their intelligence has never encountered opponents who think in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The tactical display updated. 32 minutes to contact. 32 minutes until the most powerful fleet in galactic history met an enemy that claimed to have transformed warfare itself into something unrecognizable. Admiral, Marcus said quietly, I need to propose something that will violate every principle of military strategy your species has ever developed. Thyrak's blood crystallized in his veins. What are you suggesting? Concentrate our entire fleet in a single formation, abandon all defensive positions, eliminate escape routes, Commit every available resource to coordinates that will place us in the most tactically vulnerable position possible. Marcus indicated locations that would expose coalition forces to total annihilation, from multiple vectors simultaneously. Present ourselves as the perfect target for enemy forces to destroy. That's not strategy. That's suicide. That's psychology. Marcus's eyes gleamed with dangerous intelligence. Based on weeks of behavioral conditioning, the Hive Collective will interpret our formation as desperate tactical incompetence. They'll concentrate their entire fleet for a decisive engagement that will expose them to countermeasures they cannot anticipate because their decision-making algorithms have been programmed to expect defeat rather than victory. Thyrak stared at the tactical projection, his mind reeling from implications that transcended every assumption about warfare he had ever held. The plan was insane, militarily impossible, strategically suicidal. And yet the mathematical models supported it with terrifying precision. Every data point suggested the Hive would respond exactly as Marcus predicted, walking into psychological traps that would turn their greatest strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. You're asking me to stake 47 ships and thousands of lives on theories about enemy psychology that exist beyond any strategic doctrine in galactic military history. I'm asking you to trust that humans understand warfare on levels that your species has never needed to explore. Marcus met his gaze with absolute certainty. Admiral, we've been preparing for opponents like the Hive Collective for thousands of years. This is what we were evolved to do. The proximity alarms screamed louder. 28 minutes until contact. 28 minutes to decide whether tactical suicide might actually represent strategic salvation. If this fails, Thyrak said slowly, we don't just die, we die as fools. If we follow conventional tactics, Marcus replied, we die as footnotes in someone else's victory. But my way, we become the species that taught the galaxy what warfare actually means. There are moments when the universe holds its breath, waiting to see whether intelligence can transcend, and the limitations that logic imposes. Such moments reshape the very nature of what thinking species believe possible. The moment when 47 ships challenged 300 would be remembered as the day warfare itself evolved. All ships, Thyrak's voice carried across fleet communication channels, each word weighted with the authority of someone who had chosen to trust in possibilities that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of strategic doctrine. Implement formation Omega-7, concentrate at coordinates 77 Mark 9. The response rippled through space like shock waves from a collapsing star. Confused acknowledgments from captains who had followed Thyrak through 30 cycles of conventional victories. Requests for clarification from officers whose training had never prepared them for orders that violated every principle of defensive warfare. Desperate questions about tactical positioning from crews who could calculate their own extinction in the formation their admiral commanded. Admiral, his tactical officer whispered with the desperation of someone watching professional competence dissolve into apparent madness. That formation exposes us to concentrated fire from multiple vectors, no overlapping defensive fields, no escape routes, no tactical advantages of any kind. I know, Thyrak replied, his voice carrying strange calm as he watched coalition ships reluctantly abandon every defensive position they possessed. 47 vessels clustering together like frightened prey animals, sacrificing tactical superiority for psychological theories that existed beyond any military doctrine in galactic history. But he was watching Marcus, who stood motionless beside the tactical display with eyes fixed on approaching enemy formations with absolute confidence. Confidence that defied mathematical analysis, transcended logical assessment, existed in dimensions that rational thought could not penetrate. Formation complete, his helm officer reported, voice hollow with implications of what they had chosen to become. Admiral, the Hive fleet is adjusting course and formation. They're massing for concentrated assault. Exactly as Marcus had predicted. Thyrak watched 300 enemy vessels reorganize themselves with fluid precision that spoke of intelligence beyond individual comprehension. Ships flowing into attack formations designed to apply overwhelming firepower against a target that had presented itself for destruction. The Hive Collective had recognized the tactical opportunity and responded with mathematical efficiency that left no possibility of coalition survival. "They're taking the bait," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying satisfaction that seemed inappropriate for someone orchestrating his own species' extinction. "Observe their positioning. Perfect coordination through distributed intelligence networks. Every ship linked into collective tactical consciousness for optimal firepower concentration. Which means they can obliterate us with perfect efficiency. Which means they've made themselves vulnerable in ways their decision-making algorithms cannot comprehend." Marcus activated a device Thyrak had never seen before, its surface covered with indicators that pulsed with ominous purpose. "Admiral, I need you to trust human strategic thinking for approximately 90 seconds. 90 seconds. Thyrak could see his own death reflected in the faces of officers who had believed their admiral was leading them toward some form of tactical salvation. Young professionals who had trusted in strategic genius that had never failed them through decades of conventional warfare. Instead, he had delivered them to slaughter, orchestrated by psychological theories that might prove to be elaborate delusions. The Hive fleet opened fire with coordinated precision that transformed the void into a cathedral of destructive energy. Plasma beams lanced across impossible distances like the wrath of gods who had forgotten mercy. Energy weapons designed to crack planetary surfaces focused their fury on coalition ships whose shields had been designed for dispersed combat rather than concentrated annihilation. "Shields at 60%, his defensive coordinator reported with professional calm that masked the terror of watching protective systems overload under assault they were never meant to survive. "Admiral, we cannot sustain this level of bombardment." "Hold position," Thyrak commanded, though every instinct screamed for evasive maneuvers that might provide a few additional seconds of existence before inevitable destruction consumed them all. 50%. 40. "Sir, we're approaching cascading system failures." Marcus remained calm, his device humming with increasing intensity as indicators shifted from amber to crimson warnings. Around them, the bridge crew worked with desperate efficiency, managing systems that were failing under assault no tactical doctrine had prepared them to survive. "Almost there," Marcus murmured, his attention focused on readouts that meant nothing to Thyrak's strategic understanding. "Come on." The tactical display showed the Hive fleet in perfect formation, every vessel aligned for maximum firepower application. Their coordination was flawless, beautiful in its mathematical precision, terrible in its implications for coalition survival. 300 ships operating as a single tactical entity through communication networks that bound individual consciousness into collective intelligence. Collective intelligence that depended entirely on instantaneous information transfer between distributed processing nodes. "Now," Marcus whispered, and pressed a control that changed everything. The electromagnetic pulse erupted from concealed transmitters hidden throughout human ship hulls. Not a weapon designed to destroy physical targets, but a signal crafted to disrupt, interfere, sever the delicate communication protocols that enabled collective consciousness to function as unified tactical intelligence. For a moment that lasted eternity, nothing changed. The Hive fleet continued its devastating bombardment while coalition shields failed and death approached with mathematical certainty. Thyrak watched his flagship's defensive systems collapse under energy weapons that could crack moons, wondering if he had chosen to die as a fool rather than a strategist. Then the enemy formation wavered. Individual Hive ships began drifting from their precise attack positions. The coordinated assault pattern that had been obliterating coalition defenses dissolved into chaotic individual attacks as 300 vessels suddenly found themselves isolated from the collective intelligence that had guided their every tactical decision. "What's happening?" Thyrek demanded, watching impossible transformation occur across his tactical displays. Communication breakdown, Marcus explained with calm satisfaction. Without their network connections, each ship reverts to individual intelligence rather than collective consciousness. Basic survival programming instead of sophisticated tactical coordination. The change was miraculous in its scope and implications. Where moments before the coalition had faced an overwhelming superior enemy operating with perfect tactical coordination, they now confronted a collection of confused individual opponents who had suddenly lost the shared intelligence that made them unstoppable. Individual ships operating on instinct rather than strategy. Separate entities following basic programming instead of sophisticated tactical algorithms. 300 vessels that had been transformed from collective genius into individual confusion by the severing of communication networks they had never imagined could be disrupted. "All ships," Thyrek commanded, his voice ringing with authority born of sudden understanding. "Implement standard engagement protocols. Target individual vessels. Concentrate firepower on isolated opponents." The battle that followed was everything Thyrek understood about conventional warfare restored to mathematical sanity. Overlapping fields of fire, coordinated assault patterns, tactical superiority applied through numerical concentration against enemies who could no longer coordinate defensive responses. Individual hive ships, stripped of collective tactical support, proved vulnerable to focused coalition attacks in ways that seemed impossible when they had operated as unified intelligence. Their organic hulls, no longer protected by sophisticated evasive maneuvers calculated by distributed processing networks, became targets that conventional weapons could destroy through application of superior firepower. "Admiral," his tactical officer's voice carried disbelief and growing excitement. "We're achieving tactical superiority. The enemy ships cannot coordinate defensive measures. They're operating like separate entities rather than collective intelligence." Separate entities, individual ships fighting individual battles instead of participating in unified tactical consciousness that had made them seem invincible. The Hive Collective's greatest strength had become their fatal vulnerability when communication networks that enabled coordination could be disrupted by psychological warfare that operated on levels they had never anticipated. The engagement lasted 23 minutes. When energy weapons finally fell silent and tactical displays updated with final assessments, the void was filled with drifting hive wrecks, where moments before 300 coordinated vessels had seemed unstoppable. Coalition forces had achieved total victory against impossible odds through application of strategic thinking that transcended every assumption about what warfare meant between thinking species. "Casualty report?" Thyrek asked quietly. "Minimal, Admiral. 7 ships sustained moderate damage requiring repair facilities. No total losses. No crew casualties requiring medical evacuation." "No losses." Thyrek stared at tactical displays showing the wreckage of 300 enemy vessels destroyed by 47 coalition ships that had survived through strategic thinking that existed beyond every military doctrine in galactic history. The most complete tactical victory ever recorded had been achieved not through superior firepower or technological advantage, but through psychological manipulation of enemy decision-making processes that turned their greatest strengths into exploitable weaknesses. "Captain Steele," Thyrek said finally, his voice carrying amazement that bordered on religious revelation. "That was human warfare, Admiral." Marcus deactivated his disruption device with hands that remained perfectly steady despite having orchestrated the impossible. "We've been developing these techniques for millennia against opponents who could think as well as we could think. The Hive Collective was sophisticated, but sophistication without psychological understanding creates predictable vulnerabilities." Thyrek nodded slowly, his worldview still reeling from implications that would reshape galactic understanding of what strategic thinking could accomplish when it transcended the limitations of conventional military doctrine. "You didn't just defeat the Hive, you made them defeat themselves." The most efficient victory is achieved when your enemy's decision-making processes serve your strategic objectives rather than their own. Marcus smiled, but this expression held satisfaction rather than predatory anticipation. Admiral, you've just witnessed the fundamental principle of advanced warfare. Battles are won in minds before they're fought in space. The bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of life support systems and distant chatter of damage assessment teams. Around them, space held the wreckage of what had been the most powerful fleet in galactic history, destroyed by strategic thinking that operated on levels most species had never imagined possible. Victory, complete, total, achieved through methods that violated every assumption about warfare while proving that intelligence, properly applied, could transcend any limitation that physics or mathematics might impose. Captain, Thyrak said quietly, understanding beginning to reshape his fundamental assumptions about what strategic thinking could accomplish. I believe my education in actual warfare has only just begun. Every species eventually learns what warfare truly means. But few are privileged to witness the moment when warfare itself evolves beyond every assumption that thinking beings have held about the nature of conflict between intelligent civilizations. The weeks that followed the Battle of Hive's End would be remembered as the time when strategy itself transcended the limitations of tactical science. The galaxy held its breath while reports spread through communication networks that carried impossible news. 47 coalition ships had destroyed 300 Hive vessels without suffering a single casualty. The most complete military victory in recorded history had been achieved through methods that it existed beyond every strategic doctrine that civilized species had developed. But victory was merely the beginning of revelation. Thyrak found himself questioning 3 decades of military certainty, dissecting every engagement he had ever commanded through perspectives that humans called psychological warfare. Each battle from his past revealed assumptions about enemy behavior that had never been examined, patterns of thinking that had limited strategic possibilities to narrow channels of conventional tactical science. The enemy's mind is the ultimate battlefield, Marcus explained during strategy sessions that continued for weeks after physical combat had ended. Ships, weapons, formations, these are merely tools for implementing decisions that occur in the space between perception and reality. Reality. The word had acquired new meaning through exposure to strategic thinking that operated on levels Thyrak's species had never developed. Human military theory transcended every doctrine in coalition archives, revealing warfare as psychological science rather than simple application of superior firepower against tactical targets. Your species fought wars against itself, Thyrak observed, studying data streams that flowed through displays showing human strategic development across millennia of internal conflict. That shaped everything about how you understand what warfare means. For thousands of years, Marcus confirmed, we faced enemies who shared our intelligence capabilities, our adaptive thinking, our capacity for strategic innovation. Superior technology wasn't sufficient. Overwhelming numbers weren't decisive. We had to develop methods for outthinking opponents who could think as effectively as we could think. The implications were staggering in their scope. While other species had evolved military doctrine to counter external threats with obvious advantages or disadvantages, humanity had forged strategic thinking in crucibles of conflict against enemies who possessed identical intellectual capabilities. They hadn't learned to fight aliens, they had learned to fight minds. Demonstrate the interrogation techniques again, Thyrak requested, his consciousness struggling to absorb concepts that contradicted evolutionary assumptions about how thinking species should approach conflict resolution. Marcus activated holographic displays showing psychological analysis of every major galactic civilization. Pressure points exist in all intelligence patterns. Zolonians shut down cognitive processes when overwhelmed with contradictory information streams. Krathari become irrationally aggressive when hierarchical authority structures are challenged. Vespians experience panic responses when isolated from group consensus mechanisms. And humans? Humans become more dangerous when survival probabilities approach zero. Marcus's expression grew serious as he contemplated implications of evolutionary psychology that had shaped his species' approach to impossible situations. That's why the Hive Collective couldn't process our tactical behavior. They expected self-preservation instincts to override mission parameters when casualties became mathematically certain. But human evolution had produced thinking patterns that defied mathematical analysis. Survival instincts that became stronger rather than weaker when death approached certainty. Strategic thinking that transcended logical limitations when conventional solutions proved inadequate. Thyrak invested months absorbing human strategic philosophy, though learning curves proved brutal for consciousness, evolved to process information through sequential logical progression rather than multidimensional psychological analysis. His mind, trained for mathematical certainty and predictable cause-effect relationships, struggled with concepts like deliberate unpredictability and calculated irrationality. Think in layers, Marcus coached during tactical simulations that challenged every assumption about how strategic problems should be approached. Surface level. What does your enemy observe? Tactical level. What do they think you're planning? Strategic level. What do they expect you to expect them to do? Psychological level. How can you manipulate their decision-making processes to serve your objectives rather than theirs? The simulation involved hypothetical engagement against Krathari raiders whose aggressive psychology had been mapped through centuries of previous conflicts. Traditional coalition doctrine recommended defensive positioning designed to force enemies into kill zones where superior firepower would determine outcomes. Now apply human methodology, Marcus prompted. Thyrak stared at tactical displays, his consciousness working through analytical layers that felt unnatural but produced results that conventional thinking could never achieve. Krathari expect defensive positioning because their psychology requires opponents who will meet aggression with resistance. They've prepared countermeasures for static defensive formations because their tactical doctrine assumes enemies who think in conventional patterns. Continue. So we provide apparent defensive positions that satisfy their psychological expectations while concealing actual defensive capabilities in locations they won't anticipate, because their strategic thinking operates within predictable boundaries. Thyrak highlighted coordinates that seemed tactically vulnerable but would become death traps when enemy forces committed to assault patterns based on flawed assumptions. The Krathari will see weakness where strength actually exists because their decision-making processes have been conditioned to expect conventional tactical responses. Better, but you're still thinking primarily in tactical terms. What about psychological manipulation of their strategic planning? Thyrak struggled with concepts that transcended direct military application. Krathari psychology emphasizes martial pride, individual combat prowess, warrior traditions that define cultural identity through successful aggression against worthy opponents. And if we appear incompetent rather than merely weak, they'll become overconfident in ways that compromise their tactical judgment. Understanding crystallized in Thyrak's consciousness like star formation in nebular gases. Overconfident enemies make predictable errors because their strategic thinking becomes constrained by assumptions about their own superiority. The simulation proceeded exactly as psychological analysis had predicted. Krathari forces, presented with apparent tactical incompetence, launched aggressive assault patterns that exposed them to coordinated counterattacks they hadn't anticipated because their decision-making had been compromised by manufactured overconfidence. Remarkable, Thyrak breathed, watching victory achieved through strategic thinking that operated on levels conventional military doctrine had never imagined. We won by losing correctly. You won by understanding how your enemy's mind processes tactical information and providing that mind with information designed to produce decisions that serve your strategic objectives rather than theirs. Months passed while Thyrak worked with human advisors to revolutionize coalition military training, though processes proved challenging for species whose evolutionary psychology had never required psychological warfare capabilities. Most alien civilizations struggled with concepts that contradicted survival instincts developed through millions of years of straightforward predator-prey relationships. Zolonian commanders remained too logical, Marcus observed after training sessions that revealed fundamental limitations in non-human strategic thinking. They cannot accept that mathematically inferior choices might produce strategically superior outcomes. Chthari psychology prevents them from appearing weak even when tactical situations require deceptive vulnerability, Thyrak added. Their cultural conditioning treats strategic deception as dishonorable behavior that contradicts warrior identity. Which explains why this evolutionary process requires extended time frames. You're not just learning new tactical techniques, you're reprogramming entire species approaches to conflict resolution through strategic thinking that transcends conventional boundaries. The ultimate test arrived 18 months later when long-range sensors detected new threats emerging from galactic core regions. The Nexus hegemony, a technologically superior empire with military capabilities that exceeded coalition forces by significant margins, had begun territorial expansion into space that coalitions considered sovereign. Standard tactical assessment, Marcus asked as they reviewed intelligence reports showing enemy capabilities that conventional military analysis deemed insurmountable. Hopeless, Thyrak replied with honesty that would have devastated him before human strategic education had expanded his understanding of what warfare could accomplish. They possess superior firepower, advanced defensive systems, technological capabilities that exceed ours by decades of development. Any conventional engagement would result in coalition defeat through simple mathematical superiority. And your psychologically informed assessment? Thyrak studied the same data through perspectives that humans had taught him to apply. Intelligence reports revealed patterns of thinking that created exploitable vulnerabilities, despite technological advantages that seemed decisive. They're overconfident in ways that mirror our previous strategic limitations. Their expansion patterns suggest they expect minimal resistance based on conventional military capability, ties they've observed through intelligence gathering. They've classified coalition forces as inferior threats that can be defeated through straightforward application of superior technology. Which provides what strategic opportunities? Psychological advantage through manufactured expectations that will constrain their decision-making within boundaries we can predict and manipulate. Understanding flowed through Thyrak's consciousness like stellar radiation warming planetary surfaces. They've prepared to fight the coalition military they've studied through conventional intelligence analysis, not the strategic capabilities we've developed through human education. The first engagement with Nexus forces validated everything Thyrak had learned about psychological warfare applied on galactic scales. Coalition ships appeared to make tactical errors that exposed them to enemy fire in patterns that Nexus commanders interpreted as confirmation of their technological superiority. Nexus forces responded with textbook precision to apparent coalition incompetence, walking directly into psychological traps that transformed their advantages into exploitable vulnerabilities through strategic thinking that operated beyond their analytical capabilities. Nexus Fleet Command, Thyrak broadcast after enemy formations had been completely outmaneuvered despite their technological superiority. You are surrounded and tactically compromised. Surrender immediately, and your crews will be treated according to galactic convention. The Nexus Admiral's response crackled with disbelief that transcended simple tactical surprise. Impossible. Our strategic analysis indicated complete technological and numerical superiority. Your forces cannot have achieved tactical advantage through conventional methods. Our tactical analysis was based on assumptions that no longer apply to coalition military capabilities, Thyrak replied. You prepared to engage yesterday's strategic thinking. We represent warfare that has evolved beyond boundaries your analysis could anticipate. 6 months later, the Nexus hegemony signed comprehensive non-aggression treaties with coalition governments, their territorial expansion permanently halted by enemies they had never understood, despite possessing intelligence capabilities that exceeded coalition civilizations in every measurable category except the one that determined victory. Strategic thinking that operated on psychological levels their minds had never developed. Thyrak stood on his flagship's observation deck, watching human destroyers conduct training exercises with coalition vessels in maneuvers that would have seemed chaotic before his education in advanced warfare had revealed patterns within apparent randomness. The sight no longer generated confusion. He could perceive orchestration within seeming disorder, careful planning disguised as improvisation. "Admiral," Marcus approached with data tablets containing reports from Galactic Council sessions where coalition strategic innovations had become topics of intense debate. The Council wants comprehensive briefings on psychological warfare applications. They're requesting complete documentation of strategic methodologies that produced victory against impossible odds. Your recommendation? Selective disclosure. Provide sufficient information to improve their defensive capabilities without compromising methods that maintain our strategic advantages. Marcus smiled with expression that had once seemed threatening, but now represented satisfaction with outcomes achieved through superior planning. The most important lesson of human warfare is that information itself functions as a weapon that can be more decisive than any technology. Thyrak nodded, understanding implications that extended beyond immediate military applications. Knowledge of psychological warfare would spread throughout galactic civilization, but humans would always remain ahead of species who were just discovering strategic thinking that humanity had been perfecting for millennia. "Marcus," Thyrak said quietly, watching coalition patrols disappear into hyperspace carrying tactical knowledge that would have been incomprehensible before human education had expanded his understanding of what warfare could accomplish. "I spent 30 cycles believing I understood strategy. Now I realize I was merely learning basic principles of a science that transcends every assumption I held about what thinking species could achieve through application of superior intelligence. True strategic mastery requires lifetime dedication, Admiral, and even then, learning never ends because warfare continues evolving as new challenges require new solutions." Thyrak observed training exercises that demonstrated strategic capabilities beyond anything galactic civilization had previously imagined possible. Somewhere in deep space, new threats were undoubtedly preparing to test everything they thought they had learned about psychological warfare and strategic thinking that operated on levels conventional military doctrine had never anticipated. "Then I suppose," Thyrak said with something approaching Marcus's characteristic confidence, "my real education in what warfare actually means has only just begun." The stars held their positions while history recorded the moment when strategy itself transcended the limitations that logic had always imposed on thinking species. But the universe was vast, and somewhere in the darkness between galaxies, new challenges waited to discover whether intelligence could continue evolving beyond every boundary that physics and mathematics seemed to establish. The education would continue, the learning would never end, and warfare itself would keep evolving toward possibilities that no species had yet imagined. If Admiral Thyrak's transformation from tactical genius to psychological warfare student gave you chills, smash that subscribe button right now. Now we want to hear from you. If you were commanding a coalition fleet against an seemingly unstoppable enemy, would you trust humanity's suicidal psychological warfare tactics or stick to proven conventional strategy? Drop your comments below. We read every single one and love seeing your strategic thinking in action.